The Wyoming wind was a hungry beast, and in the heart of winter, it never slept. It howled across the vast, unbroken plains, tearing at the snow-dusted sagebrush and piling drifts against the solitary log cabin that stood as a lone tooth against the gale. The sky was a permanent, bruised shade of gray, a lid pressed down on the world, squeezing out light and warmth. Snow lay thick on the cabin's roof, a heavy blanket that did little to muffle the wind's mournful song. This was a land that did not nurture, it endured, and so did the man who lived within it. Luke Callahan was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape. At nearly 40, his face was a map of harsh suns and harsher winters. The lines around his eyes etched deep not from laughter, but from squinting into blizzards and the unrelenting glare off the snow. His hands, thick and calloused from decades of handling rope, axe, and rain, were rarely still but never hurried. He moved with a heavy, deliberate economy, wasting no motion, no word, no breath. It had been 3 years since he'd buried Martha, his wife of a decade, and their stillborn son in the frozen plot on the hill overlooking the creek. In those 3 years, silence had become his closest companion. The grief, once a raging fire, had cooled into a hard, dense core of solitude inside him. He had rebuilt his life around a single, unshakable principle. A man stands on his own, or he does not stand at all. He needed no one. His ranch was modest, a few dozen head of hardy cattle that knew how to find grazing under the snow, a pair of stoic horses, and the cabin itself, which he had built with his own 2 hands. It was enough. The work was brutal, the loneliness a constant ache in his bones, but it was a clean, simple existence. Yet, some nights, the emptiness of the bed beside him was a cold more profound than any winter storm. It was not a longing for love. He was done with such foolishness. Having learned it only led to a fresh grave on a windswept hill. It was a practical void. A man needed a woman to keep a house in order, to have a hot meal ready when he came in from the cold, to mend his worn clothes, and yes, to share a bed. A simple transaction of warmth against the crushing, indifferent dark. It was this cold, practical need that had led him to answer an advertisement in an old newspaper from the East. A mail-order bride. The words had felt foreign, shameful on some level, an admission of a need he refused to acknowledge. But the alternative, growing old and brittle in this echoing silence, was worse. He had written a short, brutally honest letter, describing his land, his cabin, and his expectations. He made no mention of affection, only of hard work and a respectable roof over a woman's head. The reply had come weeks later, carried by a circuit rider who'd nearly lost a horse in an early blizzard. The envelope was thin, the handwriting within delicate but firm. Her name was Clara May Thompson. Mr. Callahan, I received your letter and thank you for your candor. I am a woman of good health, though I have known hardship. I can cook, clean, sew, and am not afraid of work. I have no family to speak of and find myself in circumstances that require a swift and decisive change. Your offer of a home and protection is more than I could hope for. I am a simple woman and do not ask for grand things. I ask only for a safe harbor, if you will have me. I will be a dutiful and grateful wife. I will honor the arrangement we make. Yours respectfully, Clara May Thompson. There was a humility in the words, a quiet desperation that Luke understood not with his heart, but with a grim sense of logic. She needed a refuge. He needed a housekeeper. It was a fair trade. He read the letter twice, his face impassive, then tossed it into the fire. The next day, he rode the 20 miles to Fort Laramie and wired the money for her train ticket. He expected nothing more than what she had promised, a pair of hands to do the work, and a body to fill the empty space in his bed. He gave her no more thought, turning his attention back to the relentless demands of his ranch. The day she was due to arrive was colder than the last, a brittle, windless cold that seeped into the bones. Luke drove the buckboard into the small, ramshackle settlement that served as the nearest train depot. He stood on the platform, a tall, unmoving figure in his heavy sheepskin coat, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The train's whistle was a lonely cry across the plains before the machine itself chugged into view, a black dragon breathing steam. A few rough-looking men got off, trappers and prospectors, and then she appeared in the doorway of a passenger car. Hesitating for a moment, Luke knew it was her instantly. She was a stark contrast to the raw, rugged world around her. She was thin, almost fragile, and the biting wind seemed to pass right through her threadbare coat. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that spoke of indoor rooms and a lack of sun, and there were faint, shadowed hollows beneath her cheekbones. She was not a beauty in the way of the hardy, broad-hipped women of the West. Hers was a delicate, bruised sort of loveliness, like a pressed flower found in an old book. But then she lifted her head and her eyes met his across the platform, and Luke felt an unexpected jolt. They were large and gray, the color of the winter sky, but they were not timid. Within their depths burned a fierce, contained light, a strength that her frail body belied. It was the gaze of someone who had looked into the abyss and had not blinked. She carried a single, battered valise. He gave a curt nod, the only greeting he offered, and stepped forward to take the bag. His calloused fingers brushed hers. Her skin was as cold as ice. "Miss Thompson," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse. "Mr. Callahan," she replied, her own voice soft but clear and steady. He tossed her valise into the back of the buckboard and helped her up onto the seat, his hand firm on her elbow for only a second. He did not offer a blanket until they were a mile out of town, when he noticed the fine tremor running through her. He pulled a heavy wool throw from behind the seat and dropped it onto her lap without a word. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. The journey to the cabin was made in near-complete silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels on the hard-packed, frozen earth, the snort of the horses, and the ceaseless sigh of the wind. Luke kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his jaw set. What was there to say? He had made a bargain, and the other half of it now sat beside him, shivering. He could feel her presence like a weight, a disruption to the steady, solitary rhythm of his life. He glanced at her once. She was staring out at the landscape, her expression unreadable. To an Easterner, this land must look like the end of the world, a vast, beautiful, and terrifying emptiness. He wondered if she was already regretting her decision. He almost hoped she was. It would be simpler. For her part, Clara remained silent, her hands clenched together in her lap beneath the blanket. The man beside her was like the land itself, hard, silent, and immense. He was older than she had expected, his face more deeply weathered. There was a profound sadness in the set of his mouth, a remoteness in his eyes that felt 100 miles deep. She felt a tremor of fear, but it was an old, familiar companion. This fear was different from the one she had fled. This was the fear of the unknown, of a vast and lonely future. The other had been the fear of a fist, of a locked door. She would take this new fear over the old one every time. When the cabin finally came into view, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney into the gray sky. It looked impossibly small, a tiny outpost of human will against the overwhelming wilderness. It was a lonely sight. Luke pulled the horses to a halt and grunted. "We're here." He helped her down, his touch as impersonal as before, and carried her valise inside. The cabin was one large room, bisected by a heavy curtain. On one side was a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a cooking area. It was scrupulously clean, but stark, lacking any softness or decoration. On the other side of the curtain was a large bed, neatly made, and a small wooden chest. A smaller door led to a tiny, separate room, barely large enough for a narrow cot and a washstand. He set her bag down. The kitchen, firewood's in the box. Water's from the well out back. It'll be frozen over most mornings. You'll need the axe to break the ice." He pointed to the small door. "That's your room." Clara looked from the narrow cot in the small room to the large bed behind the curtain, a silent question in her eyes. Luke understood. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "The arrangement stands," he said, his voice flat. "But a woman's got a right to her own space when she needs it. Tonight, you'll sleep there." It was not an act of kindness. It was a postponement, a statement of control. He was the one who decided the terms. And when they would begin, the air was thick with unspoken meaning. He made a simple supper of salt pork and beans, and they ate in the same tense silence of the wagon ride. The only sound was the scrape of forks on tin plates and the crackle of the fire. When they were done, he took the plates to the wash basin, his back to her. "I'm turning in," he said, not looking at her. "There are extra blankets in the chest. You'll need them." He disappeared behind the heavy curtain without another word. Clara stood alone in the main room, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. The cabin felt like a cage and a sanctuary all at once. She could still hear the wind howling outside, a reminder of how utterly isolated she was. Slowly, she walked to the small room he had indicated. It was cold, the air frigid and still. She laid the extra blankets over the thin mattress on the cot. She didn't bother to undress, simply removing her worn boots before lying down and pulling the covers up to her chin. Through the thin wooden door, she could hear the rustle of him settling into the bed on the other side of the cabin. There was no force, no demand, no threat in his actions, but the silence that separated them was colder than any blizzard, a vast and frozen expanse. She lay there, listening to the wind and the breathing of the strange, hard man in the next room, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a tear trace a cold path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, turned her face to the rough, unyielding log wall, and closed her eyes. The days bled into one another, each defined by the same relentless cycle of survival. Life in the cabin was a brutal catechism of chores, and Clara learned it with her body. She learned the particular way the axe had to strike the sheet of ice on the well, the sharp crack echoing in the frozen air, to reveal the dark, frigid water below. She learned the strain in her shoulders and back from hauling the 2 heavy buckets back to the cabin, her steps careful on the slick, snow-packed ground. She learned the warm, animal smell of the milk cow, Bessie, and the rhythmic pull and squeeze of milking, her cold fingers slowly coaxing the warm liquid into the pail. She learned the constant hunger of the fireplace, feeding it split logs from the wood pile Luke kept meticulously stacked against the cabin wall. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and the smooth pages of books, were the first to surrender. The skin chapped, then cracked, and new calluses formed over the old, soft flesh. She was perpetually tired, an ache settling deep in her bones, but she did not complain. Complaining was a luxury, and she had left all luxuries behind in the East. Here, there was only the work. Luke was a silent observer of her education. He never offered praise, but his criticism was a palpable force in their shared space. When she fumbled with the harness for the horses, his heavy sigh was louder than a shout. When the cornbread came out of the Dutch oven blackened on the bottom, he simply ate around the burnt edges, but the quiet scrape of his fork was an indictment. He never raised his voice, never spoke a harsh word. He didn't have to. His silence was a weapon, a cold, heavy blanket he would throw over the room. When she did something wrong, he would simply stop what he was doing and watch her, his blue eyes as flat and hard as river stones. In those moments, the air in the cabin would grow thin and cold, and Clara would feel her own breath catch in her chest. It was a terrifyingly familiar feeling, the feeling of being watched, of being judged and found wanting by a man whose displeasure was a constant, simmering threat. The nights were worse. The past she had run from refused to stay buried. It crept into her sleep, pulling her down into suffocating darkness. She would dream of a locked door, of a man's heavy footsteps approaching, of a voice thick with whiskey and rage. She would thrash in the narrow cot, her breath coming in ragged gasps, until a scream tore itself from her throat, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed instantly by the thick log walls and the vast, uncaring silence of the prairie. The first time it happened, she woke up trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was pitch black and silent. She listened, straining to hear any sound from the other side of the cabin. There was nothing. She imagined him asleep, oblivious, but he was not. Luke lay on his back, his eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling. Her scream had ripped through the layers of his sleep, and he was instantly, rigidly awake. Every muscle in his body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that was always propped near his bed. He listened to the ragged sound of her weeping, the soft, desperate gasps for air. His first instinct was to do nothing. It was not his concern. He had offered her a roof and food, a shield against the world. He had not offered her comfort for whatever ghosts she had brought with her. It was her burden, not his. He repeated that to himself, a grim mantra. But his body would not relax. He lay there, a statue of a man, listening until her sobs quieted into the exhausted, uneven breathing of sleep. He did not sleep again that night. It happened again a few nights later, and then again. Each time, he would lie awake, his jaw clenched, a silent and unwilling sentry to her nocturnal terrors. He never spoke of it. In the mornings, they would move around each other as always, the space between them charged with unspoken things. He was a man who had built a fortress around his heart. Her pain was a trebuchet, slinging stones against his walls, and he did not know how to make it stop. Then, one morning, after a particularly bad night, Clara opened the door to her small room and stopped. On the floor, just outside her doorway, sat his tin cup, a curl of steam rising from its lip. It was herbal tea, brewed from the wild mint he sometimes gathered by the creek in the summer. He was already outside, splitting firewood, his back to the cabin. He had risen before her, started the fire, brewed the tea, and left it for her without a word. Clara stared at the cup. It was such a small thing, a cup of tea, but it was the first crack in the ice. It was an acknowledgement. He had heard her. He knew she was in pain. It was not comfort, not in the way other people might offer it, but it was something. She picked it up, her cold fingers wrapping around the welcome warmth of the tin. She drank it slowly, and for the first time, the oppressive loneliness of the cabin felt a fraction lighter. A week later, another fissure appeared. It was laundry day, a task Clara had come to dread. It meant melting snow in a massive kettle over the fire. Her hands plunged first into scalding water and lye soap, then into a rinse bucket of frigid, snow-melted water that made her fingers burn and go numb. She was outside, wrestling with one of Luke's heavy woolen blankets, trying to wring the water from it. It was a two-person job, but she was determined to do it herself. The wet wool was impossibly heavy, and she was clumsy, her numb fingers losing their grip. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. Luke stood there, having approached with his usual quietness. He didn't speak. He simply took one end of the heavy blanket. Clara, surprised, took the other. Together, they twisted, their hands moving in opposite directions. Water cascaded onto the snow. They twisted again, their knuckles almost touching, their bodies working in a rare and unspoken rhythm. The shared effort, the simple act of him offering his strength to aid hers, sent a wave of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a moment of partnership, fleeting and silent, but it settled in her heart like a protected ember. The true thaw came, as it often does in the West, in the quiet depths of the woods. The pantry was getting low, and Luke decided to set some snare lines for rabbits. "Come on," he said one afternoon, his voice gruff. "You need to learn." She bundled up and followed him into the silent, snow-laden forest that bordered his property. The air was still, the trees heavy with white. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of their boots in the snow. He walked ahead, pointing out tracks in the snow, the delicate print of a fox, the heavier trail of a deer. He showed her how to find a game trail, how to bend a young sapling just so, how to fashion a loop from wire that would tighten with a desperate pull. He spoke more on that walk than he had in all the weeks she had been there. His words were practical, focused on the task at hand, but it was a conversation of sorts. He was teaching her, and she was a quick study, her attention absolute. They stopped in a small clearing, the sunlight filtering weakly through the high, bare branches. An old, gnarled pine stood at its center. Luke leaned against it, his eyes scanning the woods. The quiet settled around them again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Peaceful, not tense. Clara, emboldened by the day, asked a simple question. "Did you build the cabin by yourself?" Luke was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Martha helped," he said, the name sounding strange and rusty in the clean air. She picked this spot, said the morning sun hit it just right." He looked over at Clara, and, for the first time, his gaze was not hard or judgmental. It was just empty. He seemed to decide something then, a need to speak the truth of his life into the quiet woods, as if the trees were the only witnesses he could bear. "She died in that cabin," he said, his voice low and flat, devoid of emotion. "In our bed. A fever. After the boy was born. The boy didn't even last the night." He pushed himself off the tree, his jaw tight. "I buried them both up on that hill. I learned something that day. The world gives, and it takes away without reason. Believing in things like love, it's a fool's game. Just sets you up for the fall." He looked at her then, almost challenging her to disagree, to offer some useless, pious platitude. But Clara did not speak. She simply stood there, the cold air tinting her cheeks, and held his gaze. She did not offer pity. She did not say she was sorry. She just nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, and in her eyes, those remarkable storm-gray eyes, he saw not a reflection of his own bleak emptiness, but something else, a deep, profound, and sorrowful understanding. She knew loss. She knew what it was to have something precious torn away. In that silent, shared moment, surrounded by the hushed white of the Wyoming wilderness, the vast, frozen expanse between them did not vanish, but for the first time, it felt possible to cross. It started as a whisper, a change in the wind's tone, from a mournful sigh to a low, predatory growl. Luke, mending a harness by the fire, looked up from his work, his head cocked. He had lived in Wyoming long enough to know its many voices, and this was one he respected. He rose and opened the cabin door a crack. The air that blasted in was not just cold, it was crystalline and sharp, smelling of the high, empty places of the world. The sky to the north was no longer gray, but a solid, bruised wall of indigo, churning and advancing. "Blizzard's coming," he said, his voice flat. "A bad one." Clara, who had been kneading dough for their evening meal, looked up, her hands white with flour. She saw the grim set of his jaw and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the door. For the next hour, they worked in a frantic, silent partnership. There was no time for tension or awkwardness, only the pressing need to prepare. They hauled in armload after armload of firewood, stacking it high against the interior wall until the pile nearly touched the ceiling. Luke vanished into the swirling snow that had begun to fall and returned with the horses, leading them into the small, sturdy lean-to attached to the cabin. Clara brought in buckets of snow to be melted for water. By the time Luke barred the heavy cabin door, the world outside had vanished. The wind shrieked like a banshee, hurling snow against the logs with the force of thrown gravel. The windows were opaque, plastered with a thick, white shroud. The small cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt like the only solid thing in a world dissolved into chaos. They were trapped. The first day passed in a state of high alert, The roar of the storm, a constant assault on the senses. They ate their meals, tended the fire, and moved around each other in the cramped space. The second day, the wind did not abate. The temperature plummeted. A bitter, invasive cold began to seep through the chinking between the logs. Despite the fire blazing in the hearth, the corners of the room were frigid. Clara found herself huddled close to the flames, wrapped in every blanket she owned. And still, she could not stop shivering. Luke watched her, his expression unreadable. That evening, as she prepared to retreat to her small, cold room, he finally spoke. "No," he said, the single word cutting through the howl of the wind. She stopped, turning to face him. "You'll freeze in there," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as an undeniable fact. "The fire's the only thing keeping this place from turning into an icebox. You'll sleep here." He jerked his chin toward the large bed that occupied the other half of the cabin, the one he had slept in alone since her arrival, the bed that had once belonged to him and Martha. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. This was not a proposition born of desire, but of grim necessity, survival. Still, the implication hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she saw the cold logic in his eyes. To argue would be foolish, childish. She gave a single, tight nod. That night, they lay in the bed as if on opposing shores of a wide, frozen river. A bolster of rolled-up blankets lay between them, a pitiful barricade against the truth of their proximity. They lay stiffly, backs to each other, their breathing the only sound in the room besides the storm and the fire. The cold was still a living presence, but the shared space, the faintest hint of another's warmth, kept the worst of it at bay. The second night was the same, yet different. The bolster was still there, but the cold had made them restless. In the deep, dark hours of the morning, her foot brushed against his. Both of them flinched, pulling away instantly. But the contact had been made, a small spark of warmth in the immense cold. A little later, he shifted, and his arm brushed her back. A current passed between them, electric and unspoken. The barrier was no longer just the bolster, but their own rigid self-control, desire, suppressed and ignored for weeks, began to stir, born not of affection, but of a desperate, primal need for human warmth in a world that offered none. It was on the third night that the barricades finally crumbled. The storm had reached its zenith, the wind screaming with such fury that the very logs of the cabin seemed to groan in protest. The cold was a physical pain. Sometime after midnight, Clara woke from a shallow, shivering sleep. Luke was a solid shape beside her, his back to her. She could feel the tension in him, could sense that he, too, was awake. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a hand, her fingers, trembling from more than just the cold, brushed against the rough wool of his undershirt. She felt him go utterly still. Her hand moved further, finding the bare skin of his back where the shirt had ridden up. Her fingers traced a long, raised line of knotted flesh that ran from his shoulder blade down toward his hip, a scar. It was smooth and old, a testament to some past violence the land had inflicted upon him. A deep shudder racked his entire body. It was an involuntary tremor, a shock that seemed to jolt the very foundations of his being. He had been touched in anger, in passion, in duty, but it had been a lifetime since he had been touched with simple, gentle curiosity. It was a language he had forgotten. His every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to retreat back into his fortress of solitude. But he didn't. When Clara, taking his stillness not as a rejection but as permission, pressed herself against his back, seeking his warmth, he let her. She wrapped an arm around his waist, her cheek resting between his shoulder blades. He remained rigid for a long moment, a man at war with himself. Then, with a low groan that was lost in the sound of the storm, he turned, What happened next was as wild and raw as the blizzard outside. There were no words, no gentle caresses or whispered endearments. It was a collision of two lonely, desperate souls. His hands were rough in her hair, on her back, pulling her against him. Her touch was equally frantic, a desperate exploration of the hard, strong man she had lived beside in fear and silence. It was a frantic, urgent claiming. This was not the sweet blossoming of love. It was the violent, explosive release of everything they had kept locked away. His grief, her fear, their shared, crushing loneliness. It was a frantic act of affirmation in the face of a world trying to freeze them out of existence. Afterward, they lay tangled together, their bodies slick with a sweat that cooled rapidly in the frigid air. They were both trembling, a deep, internal quaking that had nothing to do with the temperature. In the flickering firelight, she saw a look in his eyes she had never seen before, a raw, unguarded vulnerability. For a fleeting moment, the hard rancher was gone, replaced by a man who looked lost. Then he closed his eyes, turned his back to her once more, and the wall was back in place. The next morning, the storm had broken. The wind had died down to a whisper, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the snow-caked windows. The silence inside the cabin was as vast and absolute as the new, white world outside. Luke rose before she did, moving with a grim, purposeful quiet. He stoked the fire, put coffee on to boil, and pulled on his boots. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He moved as if she were not there, a ghost in his own bed. The vulnerability from the night before was gone, buried under a fresh layer of ice. He was the master of his domain again, a man who needed no one. Clara lay under the blankets, watching him, and a cold more bitter than any blizzard seeped into her heart. She felt a profound sense of shame and abandonment. She had offered him a piece of her fragile, battered self, and in the light of day, it seemed he had discarded it like a spent cartridge. The act that had felt like a desperate, shared survival had, in the morning's light, been rendered into a simple transaction. The arrangement had been fulfilled. She had warmed his bed. When he finally left the cabin to shovel a path to the lean-to, his absence was a physical blow. She felt utterly, devastatingly alone. She got up, dressed, and moved numbly through the motions of making breakfast. But the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She felt a desperate need to speak, to scream, to give voice to the storm of emotions raging inside her. But who was there to talk to? She found what she was looking for in the bottom of her valise, a few sheets of precious paper and a small pencil stub. Huddling by the fire, she began to write. She did not know who she was writing to, perhaps to the woman she used to be, or to a God she no longer believed in. She wrote of the howling wind, of the shared warmth, of the shocking intimacy in the dark. Last night, I felt something shift. She wrote, the pencil scratching faintly in the quiet room. For a moment, I thought I saw the man behind the stone. I thought the warmth was real. But the sun came up, and he is gone again. I am colder now than I was before. It is one thing to be cold when you have never known warmth. It is another thing entirely to have it given, and then so cruelly taken away. She folded the letter, knowing she would never send it, and tucked it back into her valise. It was a secret, a testament to a moment that had meant everything to her, and she now painfully understood. Nothing to him. The world outside the cabin was born anew, scoured clean and draped in a blinding blanket of white. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence and a sky of brilliant, aching blue. But inside the cabin, the storm had merely retreated to a different climate. It now raged silently within the two people who were trapped there, not by snow, but by the walls they had built between them. Luke moved through the days that followed as if the blizzard and the desperate, frantic intimacy it had forged had never happened. He became a man of relentless, punishing work. From dawn until dusk, he was outside, digging out fence posts from the deep drifts, checking on his half-frozen cattle, his face set in a grim mask against the wind and the glare of the sun on the snow. He used the work as a shield and a club, tiring his body to exhaustion so he would not have to confront the turmoil in his mind. He had allowed a crack in his armor, and a sliver of light, or perhaps chaos, had gotten in. Now he was methodically sealing it shut, stone by painful stone. For Clara, this new reality was a quiet, daily torture. She tried to maintain her composure, to fall back into the rhythm of her chores, to pretend that the memory of his touch, his weight, his ragged breath against her skin, did not haunt her every waking moment. But his denial of what had passed between them was an open wound. His eyes, when they happened to fall on her, were a study in erasure. He did not look at her with anger or resentment, but with a chillingly blank assessment, the way a man might look at a tool to see if it was still functional. He saw the fire was lit, the meal was on the table, the mending was done. He saw the housekeeper. He refused to see the woman he had held in his arms. She felt like a borrowed item, used in a moment of desperate need and now set back on the shelf, collecting dust. The most difficult part of the day was the night. The practical necessity of sharing the bed for warmth remained, but the space had transformed from a refuge into a rack of torment. Each night, they would lie down in the dark, the chasm between their bodies feeling as wide and as cold as the Wyoming prairie. They lay with their backs to each other, so close yet a universe apart, careful to an agonizing degree that no part of them should accidentally touch. Clara would lie awake for hours, every nerve ending alive with the memory of his closeness, her body aching with an unfulfilled longing that was now mingled with a deep and bitter shame. She would listen to the steady rhythm of his breathing and wonder if he, too, was lying awake in the dark, fighting the same ghosts. But his silence gave no answers. About a week after the blizzard, the sound of an approaching horse broke the midday stillness. A neighbor, a burly, bearded man named Silas Blackwood, who ran a larger ranch a few miles to the east, rode into the yard. Luke went out to meet him, and Clara watched from the window as the two men spoke, their breath pluming in the cold air. Luke's posture seemed to relax slightly in the presence of another man, a camaraderie she was never offered. He came back inside a few minutes later, stamping the snow from his boots. "Silas and his boys are heading up into the Laramie Range for a few days," he announced to the room at large. "Tracking a herd of elk, he asked if I'd join them." Clara's hands stilled in the bowl of dough she was kneading. "A hunting trip for a few days," the words echoed in the quiet cabin. "The fresh meat would do us good through the rest of the winter," he added, his tone purely practical, as if justifying the decision to himself. He was already moving toward the corner where he kept his hunting rifle. "When are you leaving?" Clara asked, her voice carefully neutral. "First light tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. He began the methodical process of cleaning the rifle, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. It was clear he had already made up his mind. He wanted to go. He wanted to escape the suffocating silence of the cabin, the unspoken questions in her eyes. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of preparations on his part. He checked his saddle, packed dried beef and hardtack into his saddlebags, and sharpened his hunting knife. He moved with a sense of purpose she hadn't seen in him since the storm. He was a man with a destination, and it was as far away from her as he could get. His instructions to her that evening were delivered in a clipped, impersonal monotone. "There's enough firewood stacked by the door to last you a week. Don't let the fire burn down too low at night. The horses and the cow have feed and water. Bolt the door after dark. Don't wander far from the cabin." He was her employer, her warden, her protector. He was anything but her husband. The next morning, in the cold, gray light of dawn, he dressed in his heaviest winter gear. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and picked up his saddlebags. Clara stood by the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. This was the moment. A husband leaving for a dangerous trip would kiss his wife. He would offer a word of affection, a promise to be careful. He would touch her face, her hand. Luke walked to the door and paused, his hand on the latch. He looked at her then, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His expression was impossible to read. For a heartbeat, she thought he might say something, that he might finally break the silence and acknowledge the chasm that had opened between them. But all he did was give a short, sharp nod. "I'll be back in 4 days. 5 at the most." And then he was gone. She watched through the window as he saddled his horse, tied down his gear, and mounted. He rode away without a backward glance, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, white landscape, until he was just a dark speck that was finally swallowed by the horizon. The silence he left behind was different. It was no longer a heavy, oppressive thing full of unspoken words. It was a vast, echoing emptiness. The cabin, which had felt so claustrophobic with him in it, now felt terrifyingly large and hollow. Clara stood in the middle of the room for a long time, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat. She was truly, completely alone. For the first day, she moved in a numb haze, completing her chores by rote, but the solitude began to work on her, stripping away the defenses she had so carefully constructed. Without his presence to react to, she was forced to confront the truth of her own heart. That evening, as the fire crackled and the shadows grew long, she was drawn to her old valise in the corner of her small room. It was the last remnant of her former life, the only thing in this world that was truly hers. She opened it, the scent of lavender and old paper rising to meet her from beneath her spare set of clothes. She pulled out the sheaf of letters, the ones she had written in the dead of night, the ones she would never send. She sat on her cot and began to read, her own handwriting a testament to the journey she had made. The first letters, written before she'd even left the East, were full of a timid, desperate hope, prayers for a safe and quiet life. Then came the ones written in the cabin, full of observations about the harsh land and the harder man who inhabited it. And then there were the ones written after the blizzard. Finally, she pulled out a letter she had written years ago, one she had carried with her as a talisman of survival. It was not addressed to anyone. It was a confession. His name was Arthur, she read, the words catching in her throat. He had gentle hands at first. He spoke of poetry. I thought I was the luckiest woman in Boston. But the door to our house became the door to a cage. The poetry turned to whiskey, and the gentle hands learned to make fists. It was the silence that was the worst. The silence after he threw a plate. The silence as he locked the bedroom door from the outside. The silence that fell over the house when he was in one of his rages. I learned to live in that silence. I learned to be a ghost in my own home, to make myself so small he would not see me. She paused, a single tear falling onto the brittle paper. She saw it all so clearly now. She had escaped Arthur's cage only to willingly walk into another. Luke's silence was different. It was born of grief, not malice, but it was a cage all the same. It was a silence that diminished her, that denied her very existence, that made her feel like a shadow. She picked up her pencil and a fresh sheet of paper. Her hand did not tremble. "I think I love him," she wrote, the words stark and true in the flickering firelight. "I love the man I see when he thinks no one is watching, the man who can stand against a blizzard, the man who left a cup of tea for a woman in pain. But that man is a prisoner, and I cannot be his fellow inmate. There is a love in my heart, a resilient thing that has survived fists and iron locks and frozen plains. It is a small but stubborn flower, and it cannot bloom in a place where there is no sun. He will not let the sun in, and I have learned, finally, that I cannot live in the dark any longer." She looked at the words on the page. They were a declaration of independence. She had survived. She had endured, but she was done with simply enduring. She deserved more than to be a ghost in another man's lonely house. As the fire burned low, a quiet, unshakable resolve settled over her. She knew what she had to do. In the thin, sharp air of the Laramie high country, the world was reduced to the essentials: snow, rock, pine, and the hunt. For 2 days, Luke lost himself in the familiar rhythms of trekking, the quiet camaraderie of men who understood the land, the primal satisfaction of a difficult pursuit. Here, surrounded by the gruff, uncomplicated presence of Silas Blackwood and his 2 grown sons, the suffocating silence of the cabin seemed a distant memory. Here, a man was defined by the keenness of his eye and the steadiness of his hand. It was a world he understood. On the second night, they huddled around a crackling campfire, the flames pushing back a circle of immense, star-filled darkness. They had been successful, and the smell of roasting elk meat filled the air. They passed a flask of whiskey, the fiery liquid a welcome warmth against the biting cold. It was Silas who broke the comfortable silence, his voice a low rumble as he stared into the flames. "Reminds me of a winter. Must be 10 years ago now," he began, swirling the whiskey in his tin cup. "Me and the boys. We brought down a bull elk bigger than any I've seen since. I was so damn proud. Hauled it home. Expected Mary to be pleased as punch. We'd have meat for months." He took a long swallow from the cup. She just looked at the carcass, then looked at me, didn't say a word. 2 weeks later, she was gone, packed a small bag and took the morning stage back to Ohio. One of his sons shifted uncomfortably. This was clearly an old, worn-out stone of a story. "Left me a letter," Silas continued, his voice thick with a regret that time had not managed to sand away. "Said she was tired of being lonely in a full house. Said I gave her my sweat, my labor, my protection, everything but the one thing she ever asked for. I never once said the words, never once told her I loved her. I figured she knew. A man works his fingers to the bone. He builds a home. He keeps his family safe. What else is that, if not love?" He shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Turns out, a woman needs to hear the music, not just see the instrument. I was a damn fool. A proud, damn fool." Luke said nothing. He took the flask when it was passed to him and took a deep, burning swallow. The story was meant for the wind and the fire, a universal lament. But for Luke, each word was a perfectly aimed arrow, and they all found their mark. He felt a muscle twitch in his jaw, and he turned his face away from the firelight, hoping the shadows would hide the sudden turmoil that Silas's simple, sad tale had unleashed within him. Later, rolled in his blankets under a lean-to of pine boughs, sleep would not come. The other men's deep, rhythmic breathing filled the small shelter. But Luke's mind was a raging torrent. A woman needs to hear the music, not just see the instrument. The words echoed, relentlessly. He thought of Clara. He saw her not as the quiet, efficient housekeeper, but in a series of sharp, vivid flashes. He saw her standing in the snow-dusted forest, her gray eyes filled with a solemn understanding when he spoke of Martha's grave. There was no pity in her gaze, only a shared recognition of loss that had unsettled him to his core. He remembered the sound of her scream in the dead of night, followed by the muffled, heartbreaking sound of her weeping. He had lain there, a coward behind a wall of his own making, offering nothing. Most vividly, he remembered the night of the blizzard. He could feel, as if it were happening at that very moment, the tentative, trembling touch of her fingers on the old scar on his back. It was a touch that had asked a question, a touch that had offered a comfort he hadn't known he was starving for. He had let her in, and in the raw, desperate moments that followed, he had felt a connection to another human being that he thought had been buried forever with Martha. And then, in the cold light of morning, he had slammed the door in her face. He had seen the fragile hope in her eyes, and he had deliberately, cruelly, snuffed it out. He had treated her like a shameful secret, a weakness to be hidden away. He had been a proud, damn fool. He was a man who prided himself on facing down blizzards, grizzly bears, and the brutal indifference of the land. But he was terrified of a wisp of a woman with sad, knowing eyes. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the sliver of moon visible through the pine branches. He had made a bargain for a housekeeper, but a woman had arrived. A woman who had seen the broken man behind the wall and, instead of running, had reached out to touch his scars, and he had punished her for it. A cold, urgent dread began to uncoil in his gut. He was on his feet before the first hint of dawn, kicking snow onto the embers of the fire. Silas emerged from the lean-to, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "What's wrong? Callahan? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just a feeling." Luke lied, his voice hoarse. "Something's not right back at the ranch. I'm heading back." He offered no further explanation. He saddled his horse with swift, jerky movements. Ignoring Silas's questions and offers of fresh meat, he had to go back. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical imperative, a rope pulling him homeward. He spurred his horse into a hard gallop, leaving the hunting camp and the confused men behind. The ride home was a frantic, punishing journey. He pushed his horse relentlessly, his mind a maelstrom of regret and a nameless fear. He kept seeing her face, her eyes. He kept hearing Silas's words, "I was a damn fool." As he crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, the fear in his gut solidified into a cold, heavy stone. There was no curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney to welcome him. The air around the small homestead was utterly still, devoid of life. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a winter morning. It was the hollow, echoing silence of abandonment. He swung himself from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop, and threw the cabin door open. "Clara?" His voice was swallowed by the cold. The fire in the hearth was dead, a mound of gray, lifeless ash. The room was tidy, her few belongings gone. The bed was neatly made. The air was stale and frigid. It was as if she had never been there at all, as if she had been a ghost he had conjured from his own loneliness. And then he saw it. On the center of the table, placed with deliberate care, was a single folded sheet of paper. He approached it slowly, as one might approach a sleeping snake. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out and picked it up. The paper was stiff and crinkled in places, stained with the unmistakable tracks of dried tears. He unfolded it. Her delicate, firm handwriting filled the page. "Luke, I am writing this because I cannot speak it, and because I know you would not listen. You are a man who is comfortable with silence. But I have come to know that there are many kinds of silence. The one I fled in the East was full of rage. Yours is full of grief. But both are cages, and I cannot live in a cage again. My first husband was a man of fine words, but his hands were cruel. He locked me away not only in our home, but inside myself. I learned to be quiet, to be invisible, so I might survive. When I answered your letter, I prayed only for a safe, quiet place. I did not expect more. But I was wrong. In this vast, lonely land, I found something I did not think I would ever find again. I saw past the walls you have built. I saw a good, strong man, haunted by a loss so great it has frozen his heart. I saw him in the woods when you spoke of your wife. I saw him when you left tea for me after a night of bad dreams, and I felt him that night, during the storm. What happened between us was not a simple transaction, not a mere warming of a bed. It was a moment of truth in the dark. For one night, two lonely people were not lonely. I know you felt it too. I saw it in your eyes. But in the morning, you chose to deny it. You chose your grief. You chose the silence. And when you look at me now, you look at me as if I am a chore, a duty, a ghost. I have been a ghost before. I will not be one again. My heart, for what it is worth, began to feel for you. Luke, but I cannot give it to a man who will not even acknowledge my hand when it is on his back. My past has taught me one thing. A life without love is survivable, but a life without dignity is not. You have taken my dignity. I do not need your pity. I need a man who is brave enough to call love by its name. If you cannot be that man, then I must be the one to leave. Clara. Luke read the letter once, then twice. The folded paper fell from his numb fingers onto the table. The pride he had worn like armor for 3 long years, the stoic self-reliance that had been his creed, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The cold in the cabin was nothing compared to the glacial emptiness that hollowed him out from the inside. She was gone, and this time, he could not blame the land, or sickness, or God. He stood alone in the ruins of his own making, the last words of her letter burning in his mind like a brand. If you cannot be that man, then I must be the one to leave. He had failed, and he was utterly, completely alone. For a long time, Luke did not move. He stood in the center of the cold, silent cabin, the world reduced to the sheet of paper on the table and the roaring emptiness in his own chest. The first time he had known loss, it had been a numbing blow from a merciless God, a theft in the night. This was different. This was a self-inflicted wound, a slow, deliberate amputation of his own heart, performed with the dull blade of his own stubborn pride. The pain was sharper, hotter, more agonizing than the dull ache of grief he had nursed for 3 years. This was the vibrant, screaming agony of regret. The silence, once his shield, was now his tormentor. It was filled with the ghost of her movements, the soft tread of her feet on the wooden floor, the gentle scrape of a chair as she sat down to mend his shirt, the faint, melodious hum she sometimes made when she was baking. The cabin was not empty. It was haunted by all the life he had refused to see. A frantic, desperate energy finally seized him. He could not stand still. He moved through the cabin like a caged animal, his eyes scanning every surface, every corner, searching for something, anything she might have left behind. A clue, a trace, a reason. He strode to the small room that had been hers, the room he had so callously assigned to her on that first night. It was bare, the cot neatly made, the wash basin empty, but her valise was still there, tucked under the cot. He had a flash of memory of her carrying it onto the train platform, her single, battered piece of luggage. Had she left it behind on purpose? He pulled it out and laid it on the cot. His thick, clumsy fingers fumbled with the clasp. He opened it. Inside, neatly folded, were the spare clothes she owned, and underneath them, a small, tied bundle of letters. They were her unsent dispatches from the front lines of his frozen heart. He took them to the table and, with the dying afternoon light failing through the window, he began to read. He read them all. The pages chronicled her journey from a frightened woman seeking refuge to a woman who had dared to hope. She wrote of the raw, terrifying beauty of the land. She wrote of him, describing him with an insight that stunned him, seeing not just the cold rancher, but the lonely, wounded man beneath. There is a great sadness in him, one letter read. It is like the winter itself. I do not know if the spring will ever come for him. He read her account of the blizzard. He saw their night together through her eyes, not as a moment of weakness, but as a moment of profound, earth-shattering connection. I felt his heart beat against my back. She had written, "In all my life, I have never felt anything so real. I thought, this is it. This is where I can be safe." The words were a knife in his gut. He read the next letter, written in the cold morning after, and he could feel her hope curdling into confusion and pain. "The wall is back, higher than before. I do not understand. He looks at me as if I'm a stranger. Perhaps I am. Perhaps what I felt in the dark was only a dream." Letter by letter, he witnessed the slow, painful extinguishing of the light he had never even acknowledged. He saw the love she had been willing to offer him, a love he had treated with contemptuous silence. He had been so consumed by the ghost of the wife he had lost that he had been blind to the living, breathing woman right in front of him, a woman who had seen his scars and had not been afraid. He dropped the letters onto the table as if they had burned his hands. The second loss was now complete. He had not just lost Clara. He had lost the hope of ever being whole again. But as he stood there, broken in the ruins of his life, a new feeling began to surface through the grief and regret. Anger. He was angry at his own foolish pride, at the stupid unwritten rules he had lived by. A man doesn't show his feelings. A man stands alone. What had that creed earned him? An empty house and a soul hollowed out by loneliness. Action, swift and decisive, was the only antidote. He would not sit here and drown in his own failure. He strode out of the cabin, leaving the door gaping open, and threw a saddle on his best horse, a strong bay gelding built for distance. He packed nothing but a canteen of water and the letters. He would find her. He rode hard for the settlement, the horse's hooves churning up the snow. The 20 miles that had seemed so vast and isolating on the day he brought her home now felt like a desperate, frantic race against time. He galloped into the small town and reined his horse to a sliding stop in front of the livery stable, where the stagecoach tickets were sold. The station master, a grizzled man named Henderson, looked up from the stove he was tending. "Callahan, didn't expect to see you back so soon. Something wrong?" "A woman," Luke said, his voice raw. "An Easterner, thin, pale, gray eyes. Did she come through here?" Henderson scratched his beard, thinking, I think I remember. Yesterday morning, quiet thing, looked like a lost bird. Bought a ticket on the eastbound stage, the one that goes all the way to Omaha, and then connects to the railroad from there. Omaha, the word was a death knell. From there, she could disappear into the sprawling cities of the east, vanish like a snowflake in a river. He had lost so much time. "Thank you, Henderson," Luke said, tossing a coin on the counter. He turned and left, the station master staring after him. Luke did not ride west, back toward his empty cabin. He turned the bay's head east and spurred him on. The journey began. For the first day, he was driven by a blind, furious energy, but as the miles stretched on, and the familiar landscape of Wyoming began to flatten into the rolling plains of Nebraska, the fury burned away, leaving only his thoughts for company. He was a man stripped bare, and he was forced to look at himself for the first time. He confronted the rigid dogmas that had governed his life. Men of the West are strong because they are silent. He saw now that his silence had not been strength. It had been a coward's terror. He was so afraid of the pain of loss that he had refused the gift of love, refused even to acknowledge it. A man provides. That is enough. Silas's words came back to him. He had provided Clara with a roof and food. He had never once provided her with a kind word, a moment of gratitude, a simple thank you. He remembered her, day after day, performing the small, thankless tasks of their life. He saw her hands, chapped and red from the lye soap, carefully mending a tear in his favorite shirt. He saw her face, flushed from the heat of the fire, as she pulled a perfect loaf of bread from the oven, her expression anxious as she waited for his approval, an approval he never gave. He saw her moving quietly about the cabin, bringing order and a subtle warmth to the sterile space, asking for nothing in return. And he had given her nothing. Each memory was a fresh lash of the whip. On the third day of his journey, exhausted and running low on water, he saw a small sod house, a thread of smoke rising from its chimney. He approached and was met at the door by a woman of about 50, her face as weathered as the land, but her eyes sharp and intelligent. She was a widow, he gathered from her words, her husband taken by cholera years before. She gave him water for his horse and a dipper of cool, clean water for himself. Refusing his offer of payment, she looked at him, at the desperate urgency in his eyes and the hard set of his jaw. "You're chasing something," she said. It was not a question. "Someone," Luke corrected, his voice tight. "My wife." The woman's expression softened with a sad wisdom. She looked out at the vast, empty horizon. "A woman's heart is a tender thing," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It needs more than just a roof and a fire. It needs to be seen. When a man doesn't know how to cherish, a woman will disappear. She'll vanish, just like a candle flame in a strong wind." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Like a candle flame in a strong wind. He was the wind, the cold, howling, destructive wind that had put out her light. He thanked the woman, his voice thick, and mounted his horse. as he rode away. Her words echoed in his soul. He was no longer the man who had left that cabin. The pride was gone, burned away by regret. The silence was broken, filled with the memory of her words. He was just a man, chasing the flicker of a candle flame across a vast and unforgiving land, praying to God that he wasn't too late to cup his hands and protect it from the wind. Days bled into a week, and then another. Luke rode east, following the stagecoach line, a ghost haunting the edges of civilization. He was a man hollowed out, fueled now by a single, desperate hope that was so fragile he barely dared to give it a name. The further he traveled from the stark, empty plains of Wyoming, the more the world changed. The landscape softened, dotted with farmsteads and then small, bustling towns. Each town was a fresh ordeal, forcing him to shed another layer of his old self. He, who had lived in near complete solitude, now had to approach strangers, to ask questions, to make himself vulnerable. "I'm looking for a woman," he'd say to a liveryman, a hotel clerk, a blacksmith, his voice rough and unfamiliar in his own ears. Came through on the stage a week or two back, an Easterner, thin, with gray eyes. Most would shake their heads, their faces a mask of indifference. But he persisted, his shame and pride burned away by the greater fire of his mission. He was no longer Luke Callahan, the self-reliant rancher. He was just a man searching for the missing half of his soul. He finally caught a solid trail in a town large enough to have a name that wasn't just a geographical marker: Prairie View. It had a proper main street, a church with a real steeple, and several boarding houses. At the third one, a clean, respectable-looking establishment run by a woman with kind, shrewd eyes. He found what he was looking for. The landlady, a Mrs. Gable, listened to his description patiently. "Yes," she said, her eyes narrowing in recognition. "A Miss Thompson, a very gentle, quiet woman. Stayed here for about a week, paid her rent on time. A real lady." Luke's heart hammered against his ribs. "Did she say where she was going?" he asked, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. Mrs. Gable smiled, a warm, genuine expression. "Oh, she didn't go anywhere. Mr. Callahan," he supplied. "Mr. Callahan. She's still right here in Prairie View. A real blessing for us." "It is. The Reverend was looking for someone to take over the little schoolhouse for girls, the one funded by the church, to teach reading and sums. Miss Thompson, she's educated, you see, well-spoken. She took the position. She has a small room in the back of the schoolhouse now. A good, steady thing for a woman on her own." The words struck Luke with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't just run, she had stopped. She had built a new life, a life with purpose, with respect, a life that did not include him, Mrs. Gable gave him the directions, and he thanked her, his mind reeling. He found the schoolhouse at the edge of town. It was a simple, whitewashed building with a small bell tower, nestled amongst a grove of cottonwood trees. It was the middle of the afternoon, and he could hear the faint, high-pitched murmur of children's voices from within. He did not approach the door. He felt like a trespasser, a creature of the wilderness standing on the edge of a sacred, sunlit clearing. He tied his horse to a tree some distance away and walked slowly toward the side of the building, keeping to the shadows. He stopped at a window, his heart in his throat, and he saw her. Clara stood at the front of a small room filled with a dozen or so young girls in pigtails and pinafores. The room was bright, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She held a book in her hands, and she was reading a story to them, her voice clear and expressive, rising and falling with the tale. But it was not her voice that made Luke's breath catch. It was her. The woman in that classroom was not the same frail, haunted creature he had met on the train platform. The gauntness was gone from her cheeks, replaced by a healthy color. She stood taller, her shoulders straight, her posture imbued with a quiet confidence, She smiled as she read, a natural, easy smile that reached all the way to her eyes. And her eyes, the haunted, stormy gray he knew so well, was gone. In its place was the clear, bright radiance of a summer sky after a cleansing rain. They shone with purpose, with life, with a profound and settled peace. He watched as a little girl raised her hand, and Clara bent down to listen, her expression one of genuine, tender interest. She was not just a teacher, she was a nurturer. She was home. Luke stood at the window, hidden in the shadows, and felt the full, crushing weight of his failure. He saw the woman she was meant to be, the woman she had become the moment she was free of him. He had taken this light, this warmth, this life, and he had nearly extinguished it in the cold, lonely darkness of his cabin. A wave of shame so profound it made him physically sick washed over him. The old Luke, the proud, controlling rancher, would have strode to that door, kicked it open, and claimed what was his. He would have dragged her back to his world, back into the shadows. But the old Luke was dead, buried somewhere on the trail between Wyoming and this sunlit classroom. The new man, the one who stood there trembling, understood that to walk into that room would be the ultimate act of selfishness. It would be a violation. He would be the blizzard descending on her spring. He saw the truth with devastating clarity. He loved her, and because he loved her, he could not destroy this new life she had so bravely built for herself. He backed away from the window, moving as silently as a shadow, and walked back to his horse. That night, in a cheap, anonymous room at the town's only hotel, Luke Callahan did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He sat down with a pen and a sheet of paper, and he wrote a letter. His large, calloused hand, so accustomed to the solid, honest feel of rope and leather and wood, felt foreign and clumsy wrapped around the delicate pen. The words would not come. He started and stopped a dozen times, crumpling up the paper in frustration. How could he possibly put the contents of his shattered heart onto a sheet of paper? How could he explain the transformation of a man who had only ever known how to take, and was only now learning how to give? Finally, in the deep, quiet hours of the night, he simply began to write the truth. My dearest Clara, I am writing this because I do not have the right to speak to you. To stand before you now would be to ask for a forgiveness I have not earned. I can only hope that you will read these words and know that they are the truest things I have ever written. I found you today. I stood outside the window of your schoolhouse. I saw you, and I saw that you are happy. You are radiant. You are everything you were meant to be, and I was the man who stood in your way. That knowledge is a heavier burden than any winter or any grief I have ever known. Your letter broke me. Clara, it broke me open and forced me to look at the man I had become. You called my silence grief, and you were right, but you were also wrong. It was not just grief, it was cowardice. I was a coward. I was so terrified of feeling the pain of loss again that I chose not to feel anything at all. I built a fortress of silence and solitude around myself. And when you came and offered me the gift of your heart, I threw it back in your face because I was too afraid to accept it. The widow I met on the trail told me that when a man doesn't know how to cherish, a woman disappears like a candle flame in the wind. I was that wind. Clara, I am so sorry. I am sorry for every time I did not say thank you, for every meal I ate in silence, for every night I lay beside you and offered you nothing but coldness. That night in the storm, it was real. You were right. It was the realest moment of my life, and it terrified me. And for that, I will be sorry for the rest of my days. I have learned something on this long road to find you. I have learned that love isn't about owning a person, or controlling them, or keeping them safe in a cabin. That is just pride. I have learned that love is about seeing a person for who they truly are, and wanting their happiness more than your own. It's about letting go of your own pride, your own fear, your own stubborn self, and making space for them to bloom. I am writing to tell you that I love you. I love the brave woman who crossed a continent for a new life. I love the gentle woman who touched my scars. I love the radiant woman I saw in that classroom, bringing light to the lives of children. I love you. I am not asking you to come back. I am not asking you for anything. Your new life is your own, and it is beautiful, and you have earned it. I only ask that you believe me. I am a changed man, and you are the one who changed me. Whatever you choose, I want you to be happy. Yours, always, Luke. He folded the letter, his hands shaking. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon. He walked through the quiet streets to the schoolhouse. The town was still asleep. He knelt down and slid the letter under the door, pushing it far enough so it would be seen. Then he stood up, walked back to his horse, and without a backward glance, he rode out of town. He did not know where he was going. He had given her his heart, his confession, his love. He had given her the choice, and now, for the first time in his life, he was truly letting go. The letter lay on the floor just inside the schoolhouse door, a stark, white rectangle against the dark, oiled wood. Clara saw it the moment she arrived, the early morning sun slanting through the eastern windows to illuminate it. Her first thought was that one of the children had dropped a drawing. She bent down, her fingers closing around the folded paper. It was not a child's drawing. It was a letter, addressed to her in a large, masculine hand that was both unfamiliar and deeply, shockingly familiar. Clara. Her heart gave a single, painful lurch. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, who it was from. She carried it to her small desk, her hands trembling so badly she could barely unfold the paper. She sat down and began to read. The words were a floodgate. They washed over her, a torrent of truth and pain and raw, unvarnished confession. She read of his cowardice, of his fear, of the fortress of silence he had built from grief. She saw herself through his eyes, not a burden, not a chore, but a gift he had been too afraid to accept. She felt the echo of her own pain in his apology, a sorrow so profound it seemed to lift off the page and settle in the air around her. And then she reached the final paragraphs. I am writing to tell you that I love you. I love the brave woman who crossed a continent for a new life. I love the gentle woman who touched my scars. I love the radiant woman I saw in that classroom. I love you. A sound escaped her lips, a soft, choked sob. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. They were not the bitter tears of shame she had cried in the cabin, nor the lonely tears of her past. These were tears of release, of a deep, aching validation that she had not known she was starving for. All the pain, all the silent endurance, all the lonely nights, it had all been seen. The love she had felt, the love she had thought a foolish, one-sided fantasy, had been real. It had been returned. He had finally said the music. She clutched the letter to her chest, the paper crinkling against her dress. He was not asking her to come back. He was setting her free. He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had. A choice, born not of obligation or pity, but of a love that wanted her happiness more than his own. And in that selfless, beautiful act, he bound her to him more tightly than any contract or promise ever could. The man who had written this letter was not the man she had left. This was the man she had seen glimpses of in the dark, the man she had fallen in love with. Her decision was not a decision at all. It was an inevitability. As certain as the sun rising, she stood up, wiped the tears from her face, and walked to the door of the Reverend's house next door. She explained, with a calm that surprised herself, that a family matter of the utmost urgency required her to return to the West. The Reverend, seeing the unshakable resolve in her eyes, agreed to find a temporary replacement. By midday, she had packed her small valise, this time including the bundle of unsent letters, and was sitting on the westbound stagecoach, her face turned toward the setting sun. The journey back was the reverse of her first, in every conceivable way. The rocking of the coach, which had once felt like a lurching towards an uncertain doom, now felt like a steady, rhythmic pull toward home. The vast, empty plains that had once seemed so terrifying and lonely now looked beautiful, a land of stark, honest promise. She was not a frightened woman running from her past. She was a free woman riding toward her future. Doubts, like shadows at dusk, tried to creep in. What if he wasn't there? The letter had said nothing of his plans. He had let her go. What if he had taken his own freedom and ridden away, back into the wilderness, back into his solitude? What if she arrived to find the cabin as cold and empty as he had left it? Her hand would go to the pocket of her dress, her fingers finding the crisp edges of his letter. She would pull it out and read his words again, the ink a testament to his transformation. Yours, always. Luke. She had to believe in that promise. After what felt like an eternity, the familiar, rugged shape of the Laramie Mountains appeared on the horizon. The stagecoach pulled into the small, dusty settlement she had first arrived in. It felt like a lifetime ago. She didn't wait for a ride. Her valise in hand, she began to walk the final miles to the cabin, her heart beating a frantic, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. When she crested the last hill, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The cabin stood there, just as she remembered it, a solitary outpost against the vast sky. But it was silent. There were no horses in the corral. No reassuring plume of smoke rose from the chimney. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through her hope. He was gone. She had been too late. She forced her feet to move, walking slowly, as if through a bad dream. The closer she got, the more certain she became. The place had the unmistakable feel of abandonment. The door was shut tight. The windows were dark. She had come all this way, risked everything for an empty log cabin. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, tears of a sorrow far deeper than any she had felt before. She reached the door, her hand resting on the rough, familiar wood. She had to know for sure. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The first thing that hit her was the smell. Not the stale, cold air of an empty home, but the warm, sweet, unmistakable scent of baked apples and cinnamon. Her eyes, adjusting to the dim interior, widened. The cabin was not empty. The fireplace was blazing, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. And standing by the hearth, a dish towel tucked awkwardly into his belt and a smudge of flour on his cheek, was Luke. He was holding a wooden spoon, staring down at a bubbling pot on the stove as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. He looked clumsy, out of place, and more wonderful than anything she had ever seen. He must have felt the draft from the open door. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the room. The wooden spoon slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. He didn't seem to notice. Neither of them spoke. The world seemed to stop. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the frantic, silent beating of two hearts. In that long, profound silence, everything was said. She saw in his eyes the shame, the regret, the agonizing hope. He saw in hers the forgiveness, the relief, the love that had endured. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften, the years of grief and solitude melting away in the warmth of her gaze. Finally, he took a slow, hesitant step toward her, then another. He stopped a few feet away, as if afraid she might be a mirage that would vanish if he got too close. His voice, when he finally found it, was a rough, broken whisper. "Clara." It was the first time he had ever said her name with such reverence, as if it were a prayer. And then he did something that shattered the last remaining piece of the old, proud man he had been. He slowly, deliberately, knelt down on one knee on the rough-hewn floorboards of the cabin he had built. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring he had carved, but a simple, slender silver band. It was a real wedding ring, a proper one. He must have ridden back to town, must have traded something precious for it. He did not ask her to marry him. He did not make a grand speech. He simply held the ring out to her in the palm of his large, calloused hand, an offering. His eyes, shining with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, pleaded with her. She closed the distance between them and knelt in front of him, her worn dress pooling on the floor. She did not take the ring. Instead, she reached out and gently cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away the smudge of flour on his cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starved. "Yes, Luke," she whispered. "Yes." He opened his eyes, and a slow, beautiful smile, the first she had ever truly seen, spread across his face. He took her hand and slid the silver band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. For the first time, he called her his wife, not because she stayed, but because she had dared to walk away. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment down below and say hello. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more tales from the frontier, and please share your thoughts on Luke and Clara's journey.